Welcome back to the Unseen Wisdom. We're all about helping you connect the dots and really extract those valuable insights, from all that complex information out there. So if you're liking what we're doing here, please hit that like button, leave a comment down below, and subscribe to the channel, so you don't miss any of our future deep dives. Today we're tackling a pretty intense geopolitical situation, one that really highlights the tension between a nation's right to, govern itself and the whole web of international relations. We're talking about the fallout from former U.S. President Trump's 2018 tweet, the one where he threatens to cut aid to South Africa.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating case study. You've got this global superpower, and then you've got a nation that's trying to assert its independence on the world stage, and they're kind of, butting heads.
Exactly. And we've got a whole stack of news articles from that time period.
Right.
So what we're going to do is we're going to break down the different perspectives, the different responses, see how South Africa reacted, and also explore the role of organizations like AfriForum in all of this. Now, for anyone who needs a quick refresher, Trump's tweet accused South Africa of, seizing land, specifically targeting white farmers and mistreating certain groups. He even went as far as to call it a massive humanitarian rights violation.
Yeah.
And then he topped it off by threatening to cut off all U.S. aid until a full investigation was conducted.
And the thing is, the response from South Africans was really swift and unified. I mean, you had government officials, the economic freedom fighters, the EFF as they're known, and even President Ramaphosa himself, all pushing back against these claims.
It's like they put aside their differences, right, and formed this united front to defend their nation's sovereignty.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to remember that President Ramaphosa had actually already addressed Trump's, interference in South African affairs back in 2018. He basically told him, and I quote, to leave us alone.
Wow. Okay. So that's a pretty strong statement, right? I mean,
Yeah.
It seems like South Africa was already kind of wary of this external meddling.
Oh, absolutely. And this time around, the South African ambassador to the U.S. echoed that sentiment. He expressed a willingness to cooperate with an investigation, but he also really emphasized their commitment to, presenting the facts about their own land reform process.
So they were basically saying, we're not afraid of scrutiny, but we're not going to be bullied either.
Exactly. Now, the EFF's response is particularly interesting. They actually went beyond just, refuting Trump's accusations. They called out his threat as a blatant attempt to undermine South Africa's independence. And they also highlighted the inherent danger of relying too heavily on foreign aid, suggesting that it can be used as leverage to exert control.
Okay, yeah, that's a powerful point. I mean, it raises the question, right? Should South Africa, or any nation for that matter, prioritize self-reliance, even if it means, potentially facing economic consequences?
It's a tough question. It's a complex dilemma. And it speaks to a broader debate, about the role of foreign aid in international development. Does it really foster sustainable growth, or does it actually create dependencies that can then be exploited?
All right, so we've got South Africa standing firm against this U.S. pressure. But now let's bring in another player into this, geopolitical chess game, AfriForum.
Right. So AfriForum is it's a civil rights organization that predominantly represents the interests of Afrikaners. And they took a bit of a more nuanced stance. They requested targeted sanctions against ANC leaders, but at the same time, they also urged the South African government to amend their Expropriation Act.
So they're kind of playing both sides, trying to appease the U.S. while also pushing for these internal reforms.
Yeah, you could say that their argument was that they were acting in the best interests of all South Africans. They were trying to prevent the country from going down the same path as like Venezuela or Zimbabwe, descending into economic chaos. But the thing is, their CEO's statements reveal a bit of a contradiction.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, he actually admitted that these large-scale government-led land grabs that Trump was talking about weren't really happening. So he was kind of contradicting Trump's central claim. But then at the same time, he also argued that Trump's assertion was correct and that the Expropriation Act, which allows for land expropriation with compensation, enables those kinds of seizures.
Okay, so they're acknowledging that this crisis that Trump is describing wasn't real, but they're still using it to kind of push their own agenda.
Yeah, it seems that way. And it really highlights those internal tensions and diverse perspectives within South Africa itself.
Okay, so we've laid out some of the initial reactions to Trump's tweet. South Africa's unified defiance, the EFF's call for self-reliance, then AfriForum's kind of contradictory stance. But let's zoom out a bit. What does all of this tell us about South Africa's overall position in the world and its relationship with the U.S.?
That's where things get really interesting. South Africa is walking this tightrope. On the one hand, they benefit economically from U.S. aid and investment, but on the other hand, they really value their independence and they're wary of that external influence.
It's a classic dilemma, for a lot of nations, especially those that are grappling with, legacies of colonialism and trying to establish themselves as equal partners on the global stage. So where do we go from here?
Well, to really understand the potential consequences of South Africa's choices, we need to kind of dig deeper into a few key areas. First, we've got the specifics of that Expropriation Act and how it relates to those land reform efforts. And second, we've got the role of the South African National Defense Force, the SANDF, and their deployment in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which adds a whole other layer of complexity to this situation.
Okay, so we're going to unpack that Expropriation Act. We're going to look at the SANDF's involvement in the DRC. And of course, we're going to explore the potential economic and political fallout of South Africa standing up to the U.S. Stay tuned because things are about to get even more thought-provoking.
Okay, so let's dive into this Expropriation Act that AfriForum was so concerned about. It's a piece of legislation that's been, at the heart of a lot of debate both within South Africa and internationally.
Right, so what exactly does this act allow for?
Essentially, it gives the South African government the power to, expropriate land for public purposes or in the public interest, even without the owner's consent. But here's the key. It's crucial to emphasize that the Act specifically states that expropriation must be accompanied by just and equitable compensation.
Okay, so it's not like they're just seizing land outright, as some critics might suggest.
No, not at all. The Act is really designed to facilitate land reform efforts, which are aimed at addressing the historical injustices of apartheid and redistributing land to those who were dispossessed. That just and equitable compensation clause is there to protect property rights while also acknowledging the need for, for redress.
But I imagine determining what exactly constitutes just and equitable can get pretty complicated, open to interpretation.
Absolutely, and that's where a lot of the controversy comes in. AfriForum, for example, argues that the act gives the government too much power and could be used to unfairly target certain groups. They're worried about the potential for politically motivated expropriation, where the compensation isn't adequate or the process is abused.
So essentially, they're concerned about a slippery slope towards government overreach and, a violation of property rights.
Exactly. And that fear is definitely heightened by the fact that the act doesn't explicitly define what public purpose or public interest actually means. So it leaves it open to a pretty broad interpretation.
I can see why that would be a cause for concern. It creates a lot of uncertainty and opens the door for potential abuse.
For sure. But on the other hand, you have proponents of the act who argue that it's a necessary tool to address, the deep-seated inequalities that still plague South African society. They point to the fact that a small percentage of the population, largely white South Africans, still own the majority of the land, which is a direct legacy of the apartheid era.
So it's this clash between the need for historical redress and the protection of individual property rights. A very delicate balance to strike.
Definitely. And this debate gets even more complex when you consider the EFF's stance. They're not necessarily opposed to the act itself, but they're critical of how it's been implemented. They argue that the government has been too slow and too timid in its land reform efforts, often prioritizing negotiations and market-based approaches over more radical measures.
So the EFF is basically advocating for a more assertive approach to land redistribution.
Yes. They believe that the pace of change has been far too slow and that more decisive action is needed to really empower Black South Africans and address those economic disparities that persist.
Okay, so we've got this spectrum of opinions on the Expropriation Act, from those who see it as a dangerous overreach of government power to those who believe it's an absolutely necessary tool for social and economic transformation.
Right, and it's important to remember that these perspectives are often rooted in, very deeply held beliefs and historical experiences.
For sure. Okay, so we've explored the complexities of the Expropriation Act and the various perspectives surrounding it. But you mentioned another crucial aspect of this whole story, the SANDF's deployment in the Democratic Republic of Congo. What was that all about?
Yeah, so this is where we see South Africa grappling with another dimension of sovereignty, their role as a regional power and their responsibility in peacekeeping efforts. At the time of Trump's tweet, the SANDF was involved in a UN peacekeeping mission in the eastern DRC, a region that's been plagued by conflict and instability for decades.
And this mission resulted in the tragic deaths of 14 South African soldiers.
Yes, a devastating loss that really fueled the debate about the SANDF's role in the DRC. Was it purely a peacekeeping operation, or was there more forceful agenda at play?
So let's unpack that. What exactly was the SANDF's mandate in the DRC?
Well, they were part of the UN's Force Intervention Brigade, a unique unit within the peacekeeping mission that was authorized to conduct offensive operations against armed groups that were threatening the peace process. It was a departure from those traditional peacekeeping principles, which typically emphasize impartiality and the use of force only in self-defense.
So the SANDF had a more active role that they were essentially engaging in combat operations?
Yes, and that's where a lot of the controversy arose. Critics, including the EFF, questioned the legality and the wisdom of this approach. They argued that it blurred the lines between peacekeeping and military intervention, potentially dragging South Africa into a conflict that they weren't fully equipped to handle.
So they were concerned about mission creep, that the scope of the intervention would expand beyond its original mandate.
Exactly. They also raised concerns about the lack of transparency surrounding the SANDF's operations in the DRC and the potential for civilian casualties.
So on one hand, you have the SANDF trying to fulfill its international obligations and contribute to regional stability. And on the other, you have critics questioning the legitimacy and the effectiveness of this intervention, particularly in light of the tragic loss of South African lives.
Exactly. And this whole debate ties back to our earlier discussion about self-reliance. The EFF, in particular, argues that South Africa should prioritize its own internal challenges like poverty and inequality before committing troops and resources to these foreign interventions.
So they're advocating for a more inward-focused approach, prioritizing domestic issues over international commitments.
Yes. And they view that reliance on foreign aid as a major obstacle to achieving true economic and political independence. They argue that South Africa needs to break free from these dependencies and chart its own course.
It's a really thought-provoking perspective. Essentially, they're saying that true sovereignty requires not only standing up to external pressures, but also taking ownership of your own development and prioritizing the needs of your own people.
Exactly. And it's a perspective that resonates with a lot of South Africans who are increasingly questioning that traditional donor-recipient model and seeking a more equitable and dignified relationship with the global community.
Okay, so we've got a lot to unpack here. We've explored the Expropriation Act, the controversies surrounding the SANDF's deployment in the DRC, and the EF's call for self-reliance. But what are the practical implications of all this? What can it actually mean for South Africa if they choose to prioritize their sovereignty over their economic relationship with the U.S.?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't
it? So if South Africa really decides to stand firm, right, and they say, we're prioritizing our sovereignty, even if it means risking their economic relationship with the U.S., what might that actually look like?
Well, the potential consequences could be pretty significant. The U.S. could actually follow through on those threats to cut aid and investment, and that would definitely have an impact on South Africa's economy.
And we're not talking about a small amount of money here, right? Like, what kind of impact are we actually talking about?
No, not at all. I mean, the U.S. has historically been a major provider of financial assistance to South Africa, especially in areas like healthcare and HIV/AIDS prevention. Losing that funding would put a real strain on those programs. Could even set them back.
And beyond just aid, what about trade? I mean, would South Africa be risking its position as the U.S.'s largest trading partner in sub-Saharan Africa?
It's a real possibility. If the U.S. were to impose sanctions or trade barriers, that would severely damage South Africa's export market. And those consequences could even ripple outwards, impacting other African nations that rely on South Africa as a regional economic hub.
So choosing sovereignty over those economic benefits of a close relationship with the U.S. carries some serious risks. But what about the flip side? What if South Africa decides to kind of protect that economic relationship, even if it means compromising some of their sovereignty? What challenges could come from that approach?
Well, that path has its own set of difficulties. While it might help them avoid some immediate economic hardship, it could really damage their standing on the world stage. They risk being seen as bowing to pressure from the U.S., and that could set a precedent for future interference in their domestic affairs.
And that could weaken their credibility, right?
Yeah.
Especially among other African nations who are also trying to figure out, their own relationships with these global superpowers.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act, weighing the need for economic stability against the importance of safeguarding national sovereignty. There's no easy answer, and it's a dilemma that so many nations face.
Yeah, it sounds like a real geopolitical tightrope walk.
It is.
Yeah.
And this whole situation with South Africa, it has the potential to spark a much broader conversation about the nature of foreign aid itself. I mean, imagine the ripple effects if a nation as prominent as South Africa starts pushing back against that traditional donor-recipient dynamic. It could inspire other countries to rethink their own relationships with global powers and, those traditional aid structures.
So this could be like a catalyst for a shift in the global power balance, a move towards more partnerships and mutual benefit rather than, these one-sided conditions.
It's certainly a possibility worth considering.
It's fascinating to think about, but let's not forget about the human element in all of this, right? I mean, we're talking about real people whose lives are directly affected by these political decisions.
Absolutely. Those healthcare programs, we talked about potential job losses if trade is disrupted. These have real, tangible consequences for everyday South Africans, and we can't overlook the psychological impact either. That frustration of feeling like your country is being pressured on the world stage is very real.
Yeah, and for anyone who might think this is all just, abstract political maneuvering, it's important to remember that these choices have a very real impact.
Agreed. And this brings us back to that other situation we discussed, the SANDF deployment in the DRC and the tragic deaths of those soldiers. It serves as a stark reminder that these decisions about sovereignty, intervention, self-reliance, they have human costs.
It also highlights how intricate international relations really are. It's rarely a clear-cut case of good guys versus bad guys. There are often multiple actors with competing interests, and the situation can change so rapidly.
Exactly. But while the situation is complex, it's not all doom and gloom. There are opportunities for positive change amidst these challenges. Think about that unified response we saw from South Africans across the political spectrum when Trump made those accusations. It demonstrates a powerful sense of national pride and solidarity.
It's true that shared commitment to defending their nation's sovereignty, it really transcended those political divisions.
Yeah.
And that kind of unity can be a driving force for positive change,
Yeah.
It can foster innovation and lead to a more independent and prosperous future.
Precisely. Challenging times can also present opportunities for growth and transformation. And this is a key point for our listeners to consider. How can individuals navigate these complex global dynamics and contribute to a more just and equitable world?
That's a big question, especially when it's easy to feel overwhelmed by these large-scale geopolitical events and feel like you can't really do anything about it. Where do we even begin?
It starts with education. We need to critically examine the information we're consuming and understand the potential biases, especially in this age of information overload and social media. Remember, Trump's tweet was based on misinformation. It's a stark reminder that not everything we read or hear is accurate.
We need to be more discerning about our sources, question our assumptions, seek out diverse perspectives.
Absolutely. And beyond just educating ourselves, we can support organizations that are working to promote justice and equality both in South Africa and globally. There are countless NGOs and grassroots movements addressing issues like poverty, inequality, human rights violations.
So we can donate, volunteer, or even just amplify their voices on social media.
Exactly. Even small actions can have a ripple effect. And don't forget about the power we have as consumers. We can choose to support businesses that are aligned with our values, effectively using our purchasing power to promote ethical practices.
So educate ourselves, take action through supporting organizations, and be conscious consumers. What else can we do?
It might sound simplistic, but never underestimate the power of dialogue and empathy. It's easy to fall into an us versus them mentality when you're dealing with these complex international issues. But remembering that there are real people on all sides of these debates is so crucial. People with their own unique stories, struggles, and hopes for the future.
Instead of resorting to demonization, we should strive to understand different perspectives, engage in respectful dialogue, listen with an open mind, seek common ground.
Well said. It all comes back to that question we posed earlier about South Africa's path forward. Should they prioritize their economic ties with the U.S. or their sovereignty? It's a complex decision with no easy answers.
But that's what makes this deep dive so compelling. We're not here to provide simple solutions or tell you what to think. We're here to equip you with the knowledge and the tools to think critically and form your own informed opinions.
And ultimately, to take action in a way that aligns with your values, whether it's through education activism or simply engaging in thoughtful dialogue, we all have a role to play in shaping a more just and equitable world.
So as we wrap up this episode, we leave you with one final thought to ponder. In an increasingly interconnected world, how can we strike that balance between national interests and global cooperation? It's a question that will continue to challenge us for years to come.
Indeed.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the intricate world of international relations. We hope it's provided you with some new insights and perspectives. Until next time, keep seeking those unseen wisdoms.